Welcome. And I and thanks to you that you made it on the third day of the conference. Early morning, 9 o'clock. It's raining, can be a challenge. So and I really hope you have a good time in our city of Malmö. That's I chose the topic welfare without growth because I think that the welfare and well-being concerns of the current generations, well, in the rich countries, vis-à-vis future generations and people in poor countries, will be one of the crucial battlefields when it comes to the question if and to what extent alternative discourses such as degrowth can become hegemonic. I'll first talk about traditional welfare research and then outline the concept of sustainable welfare, which aims to integrate environmental sustainability and social welfare research. The second half of my talk is dedicated to challenges both to sustainable welfare in degrowth becoming hegemonic. Being a sociologist, I relate this to the structure agency problem, which is often seen as the key problem of the social sciences. In other words, the paradox that social structures can only be produced through human purposeful action, but that many of these structures should be understood as unintended results of intended action. Well, my standard example for that for students is if you go to the coffee shop after a lecture, either being exhausted or bored, what you do is you hand over some coins to get the coffee. What you want is to kind of rebalance your nicotine balance, but what you unintendedly do as well is reproduce the use of commodity and money, which are very, very key structures of society. And in a similar way, many things in society are reproduced. The language we use, no one, when we go to the coffee shop talking Swedish, no one says today, I'm going to reproduce the Swedish language as the main language in Sweden, but I just want to have the coffee. And I'll come back to that. So I decided to focus first a little bit more on existing social structures and institutions and how they are entangled with economic growth. And then I move on to the actor side and see how the growth imperative is perceived by people in day-to-day society. And I will finally address the potential role of the state in an ecological and social transformation and suggest some ways forward. So, as you probably heard, so I'm originally from Germany, and thanks to my countrymen, in 1945, Europe was basically in shatters. And that meant there was a huge demand for mass-produced goods, which could be actually produced by means of mass production. Two things seem to have come together that kind of fueled the post-war growth period, which is at the same time the kind of, well, some people call it the golden era of welfare capitalism. So there was on the one hand high demand for mass-produced goods, plus on the other hand full employment of the workforce. That resulted in unprecedented profit rates for companies. If you look at it statistically, that goes back to my work really a bit longer. Longer back in the 50s and 60s, you have GDP growth rates from 10% in countries like Germany, and the same is true for companies' profit rates. And at the same time, you had really almost equally fast real wage growth rates. So if you have full employment, the trade unions are in a good position to negotiate. So that you find actually real growth, real wage growth rates also from almost 10% in that time. And when both and that was happening, the regulation theorists talk about that the production norms and the production norms kind of went in parallel for some times. And if that happens for a considerable time, then a third institution is also happy, and that's the state, which which attracts a lot of revenues, which was partially used to build and expand the modern welfare system. That was the time, basically. I'm talking the 50s, 60s, 70s, when welfare states were not necessarily invented and built, but heavily expanded. So, for example, the idea that you get health treatment regardless how rich you are, that you get a minimum pension and unemployment benefits, all these things didn't really exist, or not to that extent anyway, than before the Second World War. A lot of things should be added to understand that there were, of course, external factors to that. I grew up in West Berlin, where I could observe the Cold War firsthand, and at the time it was almost a consensus that West German workers had to be, and their families had to be better off than their class mates in the East. That has changed obviously a lot after the wall came down. That's why the German politician Gregor Gysi always says that the best results the German Democratic Republic ever achieved was in the West, in the Federal Republic of Germany. So then welfare researchers started to look a bit then how the state basically takes care of particular social risks, such as ill health, unemployment, etc., and started to cluster the different Western European and North American and Australian welfare states in regimes, which differ as to how capitalist growth is reconciled with egalitarian goals and the degree to which it is possible to survive without having to sell one's labor power. That is the famous decommodification concept originally suggested by Asping Anderson. In decommodification, you have the word commodity, and if Marx was right in saying that the capitalist societies in capitalist societies, social relations and economic categories tend to take the form of commodities and money, then now it is the state that does something about it and decommodifies social and economic relations so that particular groups of the population can live without having to sell their labor power. For example, students also. Old people, ill people, etc. And as I said, this resulted in quite considerable well-being concern. Life expectancy grew. I guess also subjective well-being increased over that time. So a lot of social risks that could have been almost deadly before the Second World War became, so to speak, regulated. So there were different ways, of course, how the state does it. And in the Nordic world, and maybe you want to hear a little bit about the Nordic or social democratic welfare regime, they, in all empirical comparative results, they came out as the most egalitarian ones. Where not only class relations were to some extent cushioned, but also gender relations were made some step forward in what you say. So when the first people in social policy, and I'm now in a social policy area, started to think about environmental sustainability issues, and that's of course what we have to address too. They thought that, well, if social democratic welfare regimes, as opposed to, for example, liberal welfare regimes, as in the UK or the US, and conservative ones, such as in Germany, for example, so if social democratic welfare states perform best, so to speak, on equality and welfare, maybe they do also they do that also in environmental sustainability terms. So scholars such as Meadowcroft and Dryjek, they came up with the thesis that, well, the discourse on environmental modernization would be most widespread in the Nordic countries, and from that you could deduct the hypothesis that they also perform the best way in basically combining social equality and ecological sustainability, which is something, of course, we are interested in the degrowth research community. So my colleague from University of Bielefeld, Martin Fritz, I'm happy to see him here, and we tried to find out. No, this is what researchers do. The first thing we did is that no one ever actually had kind of controlled this hypothesis that the social democratic welfare states are also doing well in environmental terms, and then we tried to operationalize two dimensions. First, decommodification after Esping-Andersen, the overall expenditure for social protection as percent of GDP, and stratification, income inequality and Gini index. And then we have a few ecology standard indicators, the percent electricity generated from renewables, CO2 emissions per capita, national ecological footprints, and also regulation, that is environmental taxes in percent of GDP, and public expenditures for environmental protection in percent of GDP. And then we carried out a correspondence analysis, which basically shows you how two different dimensions are associated to each other. So the sociologists amongst you may remember Pierre Bourdieu's tables in Distinction, where it was about a kind of taste and class, and here it is about welfare and ecology. So in the synthesis of the synthesis of an integration of welfare and ecology is right, then the Nordic countries should be kind of in the middle of the graph, somewhere up there, where indeed you find Sweden. But you do not find the other Nordic countries in that area. You find them rather at the welfare, in the welfare area of the pole. So our comparative analysis confirms for the maybe thousandth time that the Nordic countries doing best in social inequality terms, but they do not necessarily and not at all actually do so also in ecological terms. Instead, on the ecological front, you find countries rather like, for example, Switzerland, but especially countries that are actually not so strong, so to speak, on GDP like Turkey. Also, when we looked a bit further into Sweden, we found that much of the relative good performance there is down to the use of water power, which is very in terms of renewables, which other countries just don't have, and if you kind of calculate that out of the calculation, then Sweden doesn't look so good after all. So we could not confirm this idea of a synthesis of social democratic welfare state making, and also quasi automatically turning into also an environmental state. Instead, what we at least put to the table at that time, it was 2014, well, here we might have actually a case of unintended consequences of purposeful action. It may be that the same mechanism that actually does something about inequality, the state, at the same time brings people in the position to lead lifestyles that are economically harmful. So you want to do something positive on equality, and that is important, but you do not think about it, and you actually bring people in the position that they, fly to Thailand a few times a year or something. So that brought us already in the position of looking a bit more closely into GDP and how this hangs together. And to quote a former British Prime Minister, I think there's no alternative to degrowth. If we here in this article, Martin and I, we have looked at sustainability, environmental sustainability, social inclusion, and quality of life indicators relative to GDP capita. And we divided 138 countries of the world. That means now not only the rich countries, but across the board from poor, developing, emerging, rich to what we call overdeveloped countries. That is when you have a per capita income from over 50,000. What you see here is the richer the countries get, or the clusters of country. We clustered them according to GDP per capita. And we ended up with about 30 or so in each cluster. The richer the countries get, so to speak, the dirtier they are. Yeah? So if you look at CO2 emissions per capita or the ecological footprint of production and consumption, this goes up and up and up, the more GDP per capita you have. The problem is, and that is something we'll have to grapple with and to take on in also in degrowth, sustainable welfare theorizing, is that the social indicators and the quality of life indicators largely also grow with GDP. That means the richer countries, up until to the rich countries on the country level, are less unequal than the poorer ones, and the richer countries, up until the rich, not the overdeveloped one, are also more democratic. And what I will think a bit more about later is the subjective well-being a context, which also goes up. So the richer, the dirtier, the happier. That brought us in Lund, not only that, but among other things, that to think about welfare in kind of new terms. So traditionally, it was basically redistribution of economic and social resources within growing economies in terms of GDP. And sustainable welfare is then making welfare theory, system and policies compatible with principles of environmental sustainability, which Inge has laid out so well yesterday. And I really want to highlight, and I hope my employer is kind of listening right now, that this was a collective effort made possible at our Pufendorf Institute for Advanced Research, which kind of sponsors research projects which are not already so far that they immediately produce results and money, but where you can actually develop ideas a little bit that may later turn into research projects which may get money or not. So we had there 5 representatives of 5 different Lund University faculties, plus Kate Soper and Hubert Buch-Hansen, who you know also. So the point of departure is then that climate change as a transnational and transgenerational phenomenon requires the extension of the distributive principles and underlying existing welfare systems to include those in other countries and future generations. So sustainable welfare should be guided by both universalizability and intertemporality. One of the first things we grappled with there is what kind of well-being should be looking at, subjective or objective or both. And you saw already that there is some kind of mixed evidence on subjective well-being in relative to growth within countries over time, and that is very often referred to, the famous Easterlin paradox, I think also quite often taken up in degrowth. Subjective well-being scores do not increase parallel to GDP income after a rather modest level. It looks a bit different when you look at countries in a comparative way, as a cross-country perspective. Dan O'Neill, for example, observes a correlation, who has also a big size of countries, I don't know, 150 maybe or so. He observes a correlation between biophysical scale and human well-being. Countries with a large per capita footprint tend to score highly on life satisfaction, while countries with small per capita footprint tend to score poorly. And in our study, we could confirm that the richer in GDP capita the country the country is, the higher the subjective well-being score was. On top of that, there are some methodological issues with subjective well-being, which leads us to kind of deprioritize it a bit in our research. So in contrast to GDP per capita, which can in principle grow forever, limitless, because it's just a number that can be turned into a bigger number, subjective well-being is usually measured on a bounded scale, for example, from 0 to 10. And so it cannot grow in the same way as the GDP per capita. Right? So, for example, our Danish friends, they're always the happiest of all. They have already reached something like between 8 and 9, and it is very difficult to kind of score even higher happiness or subjective well-being scores. So that might actually, to some extent, explain the so-called paradox of Easterlin. Another thing that Milena Büchs and I have taken up in our book, Post-Growth and Well-Being, is the difference between adaptation, which is often referred to for example, Easterlin. So kind of you have a higher material standard of living, and then your kind of ideas adapt to it and your values adapt to it, and then you're going back to normal. That is very important and should be highlighted. But we are not so sure that the same is true for loss aversion. So well-being impacts of economic growth and contraction are likely to differ. So while there is research on lottery winners that show, quite interestingly, I think, that after some time the lottery winners are just as happy or unhappy as before, this is not the case for people who ended up in an accident, with some kind of impairment. The subjective well-being scores of these people are actually lower than before. Then there are a few things that Hubert Buchansen, Martin Fritz, and I have worked on in another article, which are also at least a bit problematic about using happiness in this kind of issue. That is, there is this kind of Western idea that we have to be happy all the time, and if we are not happy, something is wrong with us, and that seems to be kind of in contrast to the fact that we also see kind of record numbers of people on medication and on some kind of pills who need to be treated in some way so that they're basically perform as they're supposed to be. It's also in industrial relations, there is an emphasis these days on flat hierarchies where everybody can say their opinion and so. And that leads to a blurring of the sphere of work and the sphere of leisure, and can in many cases have the result that people identify themselves a bit too much with the company, and maybe if companies is not going too well, that then immediately it results in kind of unhappiness. So I just want to highlight that this kind of thing is not against subjective well-being as such, and to use it, but maybe to put it with John O'Neill, it's probably not the best way to argue against growth as yet. So we ended up with prioritizing, and that is not prioritizing doesn't mean only to look at objective well-being indicators, but look at them in the first place, and maybe look at subjective well-being in relation to that. And there we ended up and rediscovered the kind of needs approaches that were independently developed in the early 90s by Doyle and Gough and Max Neef, and kind of then we looked a bit what we can do with these kind of theories as an attempt to objectively understand and measure well-being. Well, if we take the concept of Doyle and Gough, and I think there's a lot of overlap with Max Neef, and I don't think I have to go now into the distinction so much. According to Doyle and Gough, there are only two basic human needs. One is physical and mental health. The other one is critical autonomy, the ability to make informed choices. And then they discuss universal needs satisfiers. There are 6 in relation to physical and mental health. Well, to nutritional food and clean water, protective housing, and so on. And there are 5 in relation to critical autonomy, including secure childhood, economic security, and appropriate education. And then on the third level, they look at culturally, socially, and locally specific needs satisfiers. These are identified on the one hand through the best available scientific knowledge, but I think that should be emphasized, and I'll come back to that, also through the practical knowledge, the experiential knowledge in various subcultures, local communities, and civil societies. And we kind of opted a bit for Doyle and Gough's model because Gough has recently directly kind of related his original concept to sustainability issues, particularly climate change. So needs are, and that is both true for both concepts, they are non-negotiable and non-substitutable. So if you are thirsty and need water, you are not helped by getting a new flat, for example. Yes. And a failure to satisfy these basic needs produces what Doyle and Gough called serious harm. Unlike wants, needs are limited, few, and satiable, and in principle compatible with environmental limits. Due to ecological overshoot, less than the optimal generalizable satisfaction of basic needs may be possible to achieve. Societies would then need to find democratic ways to debate possible offsets between the satisfaction of the needs and wants of current and future generations. This is something that Milena Büchs and I work currently a little bit on. Can we have a kind of dialogue with future generations based on the need theory? So Gough has here also some interesting proposals to make. He says, as a general guideline when trying to consider future generations and current policy making and need satisfaction, present needs should always take precedence over the basic needs of the future. But basic needs of the future should take precedence over the extravagant luxury of the present. So the good thing about the rather parsimonious concept of human needs is that future people will actually have the same one as we. So just like us, they will have the same needs as those of the present, for example, for affiliation, cognitive and emotional expression, understanding, and critical thought. And if we think in these lines, and that can be spelled out a bit more concrete, that would have repercussions for the way that we organize economy and society today. That would need to be assessed both would need to be assessed according to their ability to supply sufficient and appropriate needs satisfiers. So far for the sustainable welfare concept, which is going on in many ways empirically, theoretical based on. So we, for example, have a project now with Håkan Johansson, who I see there as project leader on urban sustainable welfare. You'll hear a bit about that later on. And I think it was interesting for me to see last year that people that I wasn't in touch so much before seem to have come a similar way. I went to a workshop in Leeds last year, and of course, and Milena had just got there, and they also seem to be favoring the needs concept quite strongly in their work on well-being. So it's probably not a bad sign. But now I come to the challenges in the second half of this to sustainable welfare and degrowth. And I do that because I think if we understand these challenges better, then we may be also in a better position to do something about them. So I really don't do that to undermine degrowth or sustainable welfare thinking. Well, in Post-Growth and Well-Being, in that book from last year, Milena Büchs and I argue that well-being is generated through social practices, which connect micro and macro levels of society, agency, and structure. Through social practice, actors continuously recreate a variety of social structures, which are then again manifested at the micro level in people's minds, identities, perceptions, skills, bodies, etc., and on which people draw in their actions. The growth paradigm itself, as you see there on the right-hand side of the graph, is related to a variety of coupled social structures, or institutions, if you like, which are at the moment centered around market capitalism. This includes the role of the welfare state, which, as we have seen in the beginning, currently is dependent on growth. Daniel Bailey has convincingly argued that the tax losses due in an absence of growth would be unlikely to be fully compensated by, for example, taxing the rich. However, this means that the capability of the traditional welfare state to smoothen economic crises would diminish. This in turn would call for wider societal debates on a shrinking welfare state. One could, for example, envisage that a smaller health service could be acceptable in an economic context that produces less stress and status competition. But welfare state shrinking is clearly a difficult topic to bring in an election campaign that needs much more elaboration, given that such shrinking is normally associated with neoliberalism. So we would have a kind of alternative shrinking in this, and that is obviously a lot to do about this. And if well-being is embedded in a variety of social structures and institutions, which are themselves coupled to each other, what would be required for a transition to a new socio-economic system is that all of these coupled institutions would need to change in tandem. That means roughly at the same speed. Unfortunately, we could not come up with any historical example for such simultaneous change of a range of institutions under democratic conditions. Instead, what you often find in these, when you have a quick change of a range institution is what the French sociologist Émile Durkheim called anomie. Anomie is in a way that the absence of norms, maybe not the total absence, but the norms and values that people have developed in a particular social embedding are not, they do not fit anymore the changed social environment. And of course, Durkheim wrote about that in the 19th century in relation to the industrialization period, and similar things happened, for example, in Eastern Germany, which is probably the closest to a at least formally democratic transition on kind of all fronts, on various institutions. So the German Democratic Republic was certainly not a paradise, but it was a society nevertheless, a society with an economy, the planned state-run economy. It had a political system where the party was always right, and it had also a welfare system which was actually not so different from the Swedish one. And then then sociologists had, of course, a brilliant time then to observe what happened after, I think it was the 3rd of November 1990, when virtually overnight everything changed for people in Eastern Germany. So now they were in a pluralist democracy where the best system that money can buy, as Inge says yesterday. And there was a different economic system with the market playing a much bigger role, and also a different welfare system with the conservative hallmark. And what you found there empirically was, for example, that the fertility rate in Eastern Germany dropped to, I think it was 0.7% from much over 2 at GDR times. So anomie is really a risk that we face when we try to change a range of institutions at the same time. And in turn, this is likely to have implication, and it definitely had implications in the East German case, for well-being and how well-being is perceived, and not positive ones. On the actor side, I think I leave that a bit shorter because I already referred to that in our book presentation on Monday from the new book by Katja Tchaikovskaya, Alexander Paulson, and Stefania Barka about the emerging political economy of degrowth. So I think I already there lined out a little bit, and I did that also in a recent article in Environmental Values, how the growth paradigm itself, both in production and consumption, is perceived as a kind of the natural way to run the show, so to speak, to run the economy and to consume and have a life. Yeah. In Marx, you always have this from the beginning with the commodity to at the end of the 3rd volume of Capital, where the manuscript breaks off. You have basically this threefold step to discuss economic categories, social relations, and forms and modes of consciousness, and you find, if you look at that there is a kind of step ladder of mystifications, which in which the nature of profit making, the capitalist character, the particular social character of doing economics comes across as the natural one and only one. And if you look at Bourdieu and his classical studies on culture and taste, you find also that taste comes across as something that is natural. In German we say, über Geschmack redet man nicht. You don't talk about taste because you have it or you don't have it, you know. And but a sociologist, and Bourdieu did that at the time and was of course inspirational for many of us, that there's probably nothing less socially generated than taste. Yeah? It is highly interlinked with both education and capital, and economic capital, I mean. So in many ways, the growth paradigm steers the way we think about progress, about career. Career is very important because the growth paradigm also makes us think that our position in the social hierarchy, that is in the workforce and in the general society, is basically down to our own efforts. Everybody gets their right dessert, and if we didn't make it to wherever we should make it, it's our own failure. And that is pretty much in many of us. The cost and benefit calculation, the ideas of individualism and competition. So similar to the problem that institutions have to change in tandem, that means in parallel and various of them, so would our cultures and values. And of course, that is also a challenge. And then the third challenge I see, and we have discussed it, and it's far from being the only one, but it's something I've been working a bit on. And there are, of course, lots of other challenges, and that is the role of the state in an ecological and social transformation, if any. I want to say that I'm not a particular fan of the state also, and I think that the state should run everything also. Neither do I think that the state should be the only provider of welfare, for example. But on the other hand, I think it's rather unlikely that the state kind of withers away before catastrophic climate change kicks in. So I'm a bit interested in understanding how the state, the existing state, may actually be used into maybe initiate an ecological and social transformation. There's a bit of a contradiction here, maybe, if I interpret a recent article by Ines Cosme right. Ines and her colleagues write that much growth-critical thought views the state as part of the problem rather than the solution generally, but at the same time, and they have interviewed, I think, a lot of degrowthers. At the same time, Cosme et altere also demonstrate that most policy proposals are rather traditional top-down and state-led measures than bottom-up and community-led. So there's the contradiction between conceptualizing the state as an external power incapable of initiating a degrowth transition and politically appealing to it to do precisely this. So that may give us some food for thought and brings me to the last section of the talk, that is some ways forward. And you can imagine the longer I go on, the thinner the ice gets. Yeah? So I hope I can at least initiate some discussion. I'm really grappling myself a lot with these issues and do not think I have all the answers, far from it. So the first way forward is understanding the crisis. I absolutely agree with what Inge said yesterday, that we probably missed an opportunity in 2008. On the other hand, I don't think the crisis has gone away. It's a multidimensional crisis of the capitalist growth society, which continues to be indicated in ecological overshoot, unprecedented inequality, and even authors that are not known so far as growth critiques, such as Gordon, for example. He describes and discusses a range of headwinds to growth, resulting mostly from financialization and debt, so that he actually thinks it's unlikely that we will go back to a new period of higher growth rates. And even Wolfgang Streeck, who has not been in the past a critique of capitalism in any ways, but was very much a kind of reformist and believing in markets. Wolfgang Streeck is these days writing about the end of capitalism, so something must have gone wrong. I suggest I often refer to some of the classics when I'm in problem, like Marx and Bourdieu. They usually have to say something about almost everything. So, for example, Bourdieu about alternative discourses, such as degrowth, and the condition under which they may become hegemonic. So alternative discourses such as degrowth are most likely to become prevalent in periods of crisis, affecting either entire societies or certain classes, where the transformations of such or such a part of society determine the collapse, weakening, or obsolescence of traditions or of symbolic systems that provided the principles of their worldview and way of life. And if we carry on a little bit with Bourdieu's classical concept of social structures, habitus, practice that tend to reproduce the social structures, but only when the economy goes more or less well. So normally, when you are a growth society, for example, with a welfare state, what the situation would be referred by Bourdieu as doxa. Here, agency is guided by habitus. Society is not questioned. I have briefly referred to it. It comes across as the natural one. No one really comes up with funny questions. And the growth paradigm as such is a kind of pensée unique. Most people submit only if the companies can grow, I have a job, can feed my family, etc., etc. And that goes until quite far to the left-wing side of the political spectre. Yet, as Bourdieu also writes, in a societal and economic crisis, the unity of habitus and practice breaks. And this is the kind of crisis that people like Bourdieu, Gordon, or Streeck, and many others, of course, write about. And I think we are in a rather critical situation right now. Where two things can happen. On the one hand, the unity of habitus, structure, and practice breaks. But two things, according to Bourdieu, happen then. On the one hand, alternative discourses such as degrowth, for example, gain ground because the problems that society faces become more obvious. This is referred to Bourdieu by heterodoxa, but at the same time, there's also the danger of what he refers to as orthodoxa. That is that the social order is upheld by the weakening of democratic institution and authoritarian rule. And by judging what's happening in Sweden right now, I don't want to be looking into the future, but I think orthodoxa is at least not off the table right now. And this could itself explain or further detail in a strategy that we might call Europe first. Europe first, or Sweden first, or Germany first, or Denmark first. That is that the right-wing populist movements defend the West's way of life to the very end. And that may include mass deportations, I don't have to go into the details, but it's quite prominent discourse in a lot of countries. And the alternative is the eco-social transformation as a heterodox discourse, which depends on the coincidence of an objective crisis and what Bourdieu refers to as counter-training. That means that kind of elite intellectuals and activists kind of manage to kind of create a different kind of public sphere, which can then turn the tide. So from all what we have said so far, and can degrowth become hegemonic? What people opt for in the current multiple crisis will partly depend on policy offers that they can relate to. Crucial to create spaces where the growth imperative ceases to colonize imaginaries, as it's called, are measures of counter-training, as Bourdieu has it, and to upscale them. And I think here in the Nordic countries, we probably have a lot to learn from what you are doing in Catalonia and, for example, in France, or also in Germany, where I think the degrowth movement is much stronger. And I would like at that point that we have tomorrow, after the keynote, we have a meeting with, not a meeting, it's like an open session for Nordic people, Nordic researchers, activists and I don't know, maybe also artists, and to maybe think a little about how we can continue this kind of work in our part of the world. Well, ecological and social transformation can be made more attractive, I think, vis-à-vis the Europe First variant, if hands-on policy strategies are developed both in top-down and bottom-up perspective. I think I can wind up in about 10 minutes or so. That, yeah. All right. So in the top-down perspective, I think we should discuss here in respectable ways the role of the state, however big it is, and we might learn here something from materialist state theories, which all stress the link between society, civil society, and state. So state action is multifaceted. It has a lot of features, but it is far from independent from what is going on beyond it. You find that in people as different as Gramsci, Bourdieu, and Poulantzas, for example. So already in Gramsci highlighted the potentially positive educative function of some of the state apparatus. In Bourdieu, again, he distinguishes famously between the left hand of the state and the right hand of the state. No? The left hand is basically everything that is traditionally concerned with welfare, so the social insurance system, the pension system, and many things. And I would dare that would also include these days kind of environmental policies and all that. And on the other hand, there is the right hand of the state, which was also the kind of repressive, authoritarian aspect of the state, yeah, the police force, the army, the secret services, you name it. And maybe most elaborated in all that is the notion of a condensation of social forces by the Greek philosopher and sociologist Nikos Poulantzas, who kind of wrote a lot about basically how civil society mobilizing can, if it goes well, influence state action to kind of bring about reforms that go in the right direction and may even then in the long term question the social order as it is, that is in his case capitalism. So in principle, informed by degrowth concepts and amplified by bottom-up mobilization, existing state apparatuses may be used to play a constructive and steering part in an ecological and societal transformation. And I just would suggest that kind of role because on the other hand, I don't have a problem if the state withers away, but as I said before, it's unlikely to happen before we really end up in catastrophic climate change. We may illustrate this by two kinds of state roles. First, in a capitalist growth economy, and secondly, in a transition to a post-growth economy. In both cases, it is about the role of the state in economic development, at the spatial dimension of the state, and in terms of economic, social, and environmental policies. So if you think about the role of the state in economic development in a growth society, well, it's of course about monetary growth, and it is, as Marx would have it, exchange value orientation. It's about the rule of law. It guarantees private property, the principle of equivalence in exchange relations, and the legal security of economic subjects. There's also the welfare state, to which I have referred before, that it guarantees a minimum of social inclusion, but also legitimizes social inequality to a certain extent. And most recently, we have what political scientists call the environmental state, which addresses problems of externalization of environmental costs. The second thing is the scale issue, or the spatial element of state action, which is, well, I summarize it as a delicate structure subject to and rescaling processes. That means new multi-scalar structures of state organization, political authority, and regulation keep emerging. It is true that we had a coincidence of the national scale and welfare for a long time, but that does not necessarily have to be the case forever. We can think of, and I come to that in the next slide, of local states and even global and transnational states, though there is not a marriage between the national scale and the state forever, so to speak, an eternal marriage. And then that is, of course, reflected in economic, social, and environmental policies, as macroeconomic management, the intermediation of corporatist processes of various kinds. We have social policies in correspondence to the welfare state, which as I outlined in the beginning, decommodifies the labor power, but I have to say most recently also recommodifies it. Basically, it has been changed its character now with activation policies, etc. So by making labor, bringing people into work is now seen as the main thing of the state and social policy in relation to the labor market. And finally, environmental policies are meant to produce green growth, for example, via carbon markets. So whilst this is maybe more or less consensual, maybe less consensual is the state roles in a transition to a post-growth economy. Some things can be lined out which may be a basis for further discussions. So when we look at economic development first, this should be seen not so much as a monetary process, but as a biophysical one. It has, in Marxian terms, a use-value orientation. Here, the state ensures that the production and consumption patterns do not exceed environmental limits. It defines limits for economic and social inequality, and it steers the governance of public, collective, communal, and private property forms. There is state rescaling. That means certain authorities are delegated upwards, so to speak, to transnational levels, and others are delegated downwards to various local levels. So not the national level is so important and the main emphasis of the state, but global and local level. So at the global level, we would need to find agreements where thresholds for matter and energy throughputs are agreed about. And these, in turn, would delineate the leeway within which national and local economies may evolve. In economic and eco-social policies, it is about, of course, creating sustainable welfare in our concept, but principally it's about satisfying needs, basic needs, through the redistribution of wealth, income, and pollution rights. So the macroeconomic management of a mixed economy would ensure now the provision of sufficient needs satisfiers for everyone, and as I outlined before, while doing that, taking into account the needs of future generations. And eco-social policies could then facilitate the ecological and social transformation. Just a word about eco-social policies without going into detail, because I think some of them have actually the potential to turn out, well, what Eric Olin Wright calls real utopias. They first address the double injustice, which is the fact that the countries and in the world that have least contributed to climate change are in the worst position to cope with it. And the same is actually true for the rich countries themselves, where the poorer households are in the worst position to cope with the consequences of climate change. So what we need to have is a kind of a targeted policy strategies. Yeah? And I'm talking about this because I'm in a social policy department. So if we want to have the state kind of pursuing ambitious environmental targets and policies, they always come with a distributional dilemma. Yeah, ask. I don't know. There are some people from the UK here. Yeah, if we have a fancy policies that says all British houses must be insulated to Swedish standards. Well, that costs a lot of money, no? And the question is, as Milena Büchs asked in one of her articles, who bears the brunt for that? Which means what we probably need in order that governments that have quite ambitious climate goals are not elected out at the next opportunity. We need countervailing social policies that actually kind of cushion and give, for example, money to poorer households to pay. So together that would be eco-social policies that would need to be developed at local, national and European levels, and in areas such as various areas. You can read it yourself, but just let me take one example that we we have, Hubert Buch-Hansen and I, we have started to write a paper on maximum incomes. Maximum incomes are very often referred to in degrowth, but when we made our, as Hubert said yesterday, the literature review was quickly done. Yeah, so actually it is not very much expelled in detail how this could be operationalized. And I think this is very important. We cannot just say we have a maximum income on our caps on wealth and income, but we must have some more concrete terms how this is going to look like, especially when we confront the opposite side, which always has a very simple solution. You basically send home all these bloody foreigners, and then we have more space, more time, and more resources to distribute, and everything will be fine again and guarded by the military. So that is an easy solution, and a lot of people sign up to it. And I think we have to do a better job in coming up with alternative eco-social policies that we can actually bring in the discussion to win over these people to our side. And then in bottom-up perspective, I have to rip up here. 2 minutes, okay. I just want to say this this is not only, need satisfaction is not only a top-down practice, but it is very importantly a bottom-up practice, which is very well exemplified by Monica Guillen-Royo's work, who was here yesterday. So both Gough's dual strategy and Max Neef's human scale development methodology include a collective, local, and deliberative way of distinguishing needs from luxuries. Citizens, including activists, experts, and government representatives, jointly identify goods in such forums and services necessary to satisfy a given need within particular social, cultural, national, and local contexts and environmental limits. This is something I would like to do more in the future and future work if we get the money for it. It could be a way of renewing democracy and kind of legitimizing eco-social policy, so to speak, from below. But I have to stop. And 1 minute for the conclusion. So there are some issues which have the potential, I think, of broadening the movement's appeal, degrowth and related movement. As first, the ways in which the growth imperative occupies people's minds and bodies, as well as the potential cracks between structure, habitus, and agency. So it's about creating and expanding spaces where alternative thinking, feeling, and living forms and modes can be explored and practiced and finally scaled up. Secondly, the complexity of the links between objective and subjective well-being, undergrowth and degrowth, and the preconditions for the happy few to question their privileges vis-à-vis poor countries and future generations. And here I think both theories and methods of the social sciences and also political economy can help a great deal. Last sentence. I think we should have in our work a greater focus on welfare in general, but particularly on human needs, and we must be able to develop hands-on policies to kind of play a bigger role in the political process that's going up. In bottom-up perspective, the design and implementation of democratic and deliberative forums for sustainable needs satisfaction to inform policy planning from below. In top-down perspective, we need to organize, or I think we should be thinking about at least organizing for an active and, I say the word, interventionist state with substantial public investment, state banking, subsidies, etc., to steer the move towards a post-growth economy. And develop targeted eco-social policies, not only general principles, but more concretely and tied to particular local contexts at various levels. And many thanks, and sorry that I talked for too long.
Many thanks. Many thanks, Max. I think it was not a problem that you talked too long. 62 minutes, well done. But now I really think that we will have questions after this really inspiring talk. So we will take 3 questions first and then let you answer and see how many rounds we can have. So at least 2 questions here. I see. Oh, if we take 3 questions here first.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for your talk. Kerstin Wessel from Germany, Transfernomics. There is degrowth and there's welfare. And I have a pragmatic question whether you or somebody else has calculated the cost for a really substantiated welfare, well-being support. I suppose that mostly comes from the state. What are the costs of this one? And how does that relate with the degrowth, which means probably less material, or well, probably it should be less material and energy throughput, less production, meaning less taxes. Either you might increase taxes, then you might generate more. But how, in cost terms, how can that be realized?
Thank you very much also for your talk, Volker Morfer. Okay. I would like to come back to the paradoxon which you showed based on Cosme's work on this distrust for state and the call for the state, which you showed in one slide of Ines Cosme and colleagues from 2017. Yeah. Maybe you can go back. You can go back to it. And that raised in myself the question, do we distrust the politicians, but we trust politics in general? Also in your last slide you had hands-on politics as one of the solutions. So what would be then practical proposals or ideas how we come to better do more trust for politicians, or how can we create the surrounding that politicians work in a different way in order to give us those norms we trust in, yeah? So, and that brings me a little bit back to your happiness conclusions, that people are more happier than more dirtier they are. So it reminds me to some research on happiness which I saw, where this line looks a little bit different, not linear or exponential, but more like that people in Costa Rica perhaps are on the same happiness level than people in the US, for example, yeah, although their GDP is much less, yeah, and so that I see there a little bit a issue that politicians might not be re-elected if they make not the people happy, yeah. So, and where is this happiness relation really standing? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for a brilliant talk. I'm a lot to read now. I want to, it was really pretty much Eurocentric, and obviously human needs that need to be satisfied for most of the humanity and not in Europe. And so what is the responsibility of, let's say, a progressives, leftists in the global north to address this huge issue of the disparity of life expectancy between the global south, the global north, the fact that roughly 5 to 7 million people die every year from air pollution and from the combustion of fossil fuel and the lack of clean energy. So that's my question. I just want to mention that I'm from the United States. We're not too happy there. No. We have a very high income inequality, and actually the life expectancy of white folk has been decreasing. So that's perhaps I don't think it's an anomaly in the mix that you're showing, but it's certainly, you know, you're of course aware of the scholarship of the relation of income inequality to, you know, well-being and so forth. So I just wanted to throw that in too. Thank you.
Yes, Well, I definitely take the point, first of all, this is a what you call it, Euro-centric perspective. It has a bit to do, I decided to stop flying years ago. And I understand, I think, a bit of our societies here, but when I'm supposed to say something about other parts of the world, I rely on people either coming here or what I read about it. So usually I stick to a bit what's going on here, so that's one thing. I think that the life expectancy thing is a good example for the kind of probably tricky discussions we are going to have, and maybe by avoiding them, it is not really the way forward. Yeah, well, on the personal stage, last year, my mother-in-law died, yeah, and in the last stage, so to speak, she got pills, and she told me each of them, one packet was 10 or so, cost 5,000 euros, yeah. And I don't know what it was, but they were really, really expensive. Yeah, it's not that I didn't. I wanted her to be as happy and die as smoothly as possible. Yeah, but the kind of expectations we have in Western societies, if I can generalize it a bit, for life expectancy is maybe in a problematic. And a problematic contradiction to what we can afford from a human needs perspective, that would, on the other hand, potentially be in line with environmental limits. So we need really. I don't have the answers, yeah, and of course I don't want anyone to die prematurely or anything. But these are discussions that we cannot avoid in the long term, and I don't have the answer. I remember the happiness one. I think I said it, but maybe a bit too short. It's very much a matter of how you look at it. If you look at one country over time, you have this kind of curve that you describe in all countries. But if you look at a lot of countries with different GDP, then you find at the same time that the richer countries have higher subjective well-being scores. Both seems to be true at the same time. It's possible. But I think we have referred maybe a bit too much on these country-specific data over time, which include also the methodological issues that I have referred to. Bounded scale on the one hand, you measure happiness and well-being between 0 and 10. On the other hand, you have GDP, which can grow forever. And of course, there must be a kind of, the curves must kind of divert at some point. That's kind of. The third question was whether someone has calculated the costs for a welfare system under post-growth, roughly? I think the answer is no to my knowledge, which is limited. But there is some useful literature about it. But I think they don't have exact calculations. Also for example, the essay I mentioned by Daniel Bailey from 2015 looks. At the capacity of the welfare state to be used classically to smoothen an economic crisis, as it used to be, for example, by paying out unemployment benefits, but that this capacity would diminish in the absence of growth. And he shows, and he has some calculation, that could not be compensated by just taxing the rich more, which I'm very much in favor of. Was that all questions?
I think those were all. If you are happy, yes. Now we will have time for next 3. Is it okay for you to have 3 questions? And I ask you maybe to please consider the others. So please speak quite shortly, so we can have more questions. So there at least is one. There is the second one. And then there is third one. So
Yeah, first I wanted to thank you because I think it's a really well-grounded, thoughtful, comprehensive work that you're presenting and a really valuable contribution to the whole degrowth debate. And I want to make 3 quick remarks in order to get into a dialogue. First of all, I felt quite suspicious of the O'Neill literature that you're referring to, with, which compares precisely the well-being between countries according to GDP per capita, because I think if GDP per capita is the indicator, we still give the language of growth, which to me is a sort of magic language that makes invisible any relation of power a very large centrality. So I would take that out. Then this also brings me to my next point, which is that I think your work would profit very much from including some feminist perspectives about well-being, like the relational needs human beings have, which generally are kept out of these literatures, and also the absence of violence, the capacity to auto-determine their own life and all that. And I think you've done really great work on the role of the state, but from a southern perspective, this how do you say it? Universalizability is really, I think we should develop it much more. Because, and be aware of the fact that historically states in the global south have had a very different role than states in the global north. And they more have had the role of agents of appropriation of wealth and of transferring it to the world elites and generating inequality and sort of plunder, you know. So how do you deal with this kind of state? Yeah. And yeah, I also feel that the whole welfare literature is rather Eurocentric, so this is not only the problem of this work. And people in the South, unfortunately, copy the welfare regime theories of Esping Andersen, in spite of the fact that he only has looked at northern countries. So I think also here introducing a world system perspective in a critical way would be great. Thanks.
Can you then pass the microphone there behind you after you finished?
Yes. Jean from Italy, the support group. Thank you very much, because you emphasize like cultural aspect of degrowth, more related to degrowth à la française versus sustainable degrowth, Martinez Alier, that sometimes are missing, like the colonization of imaginary. And I really disagree with Andreas of yesterday that said that the climate change is the enemy, is the main enemy. I don't think so. Climate change is a symptom. For me, the real disease is the fever, is like the religion of growth. And we need really to abandon this religion of growth. That means that degrowth is not compatible with sustainable development, because development means growth, means progress is the same religion, is a religion that is similar with green growth, because if we just substitute fossil fuel with renewable energy, we know that there is rebound effects. If we do not diminish consumption, starting by waste, we will not achieve sustainability. And so we have really to know what is degrowth. Thank you.
There behind you, can you pass the mic, please?
Hello, thank you. I have a remark on the economic things that you mentioned, and also on the comment that came on the costs of these actions that we know are necessary. A state that has a central bank, that has sovereign money, has no problem of financing anything except from buying from outside. So for little states, it can be a problem. But for states like big European countries, they can finance huge programs of, for example, you mentioned refurbishing homes in the UK. As long as they have the materials, the companies, the knowledge to build this, they can finance it and they have no problem of that. And the good example is first economies of war. Like in wartime, they seize the means of production and they just tell the companies produce that much tanks and they don't ask how much a tank costs, right? On more Pacific side, all over EU, the stupid smart meters, electric smart meters, are being installed. It's completely useless and ecological. It costs 5 billion euros just for France. And they are doing it, they are forcing you to do it, and whereas they could finance refurbishing homes instead of doing that. And so you don't need to give money to the poor or ask every single person in Europe to do all the hassle of going to a company and refurbish its own home. It's really a big, huge collective thing to do, and it's feasible. And I think sometimes in degrowth we forget about these concrete, direct actions that we can do, and we're on the principles and so on. It's very useful, but don't forget that there are immediate actions, like also closing down the coal plants and so on, that we can focus on the short term, and that have great impact.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Now we have some minutes for Max to answer or address these interesting critical comments and wrap up.
I took the last one as a comment, which I mostly agree with. I think this reference to wartime is an interesting one. Where I think Amartya Sen somewhere writes about that actually the life expectancy in the UK has never grown so quickly as in the war years of the Second World War, and despite all the German bombing. If I speculate a bit, that might have to do with rationing at the time, because even the poorer circles of society were given at the time by rationing cards what they needed, so to speak. So maybe even the rationing alternative is maybe better than its reputation sometime. Yeah. And I took also the second comment more as a comment, or yeah, I don't really. I think I agree. And that's even more so for your comments. I think we should have some kind of dialogue. Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, I did not meant to say that the needs concept also tells the whole story about welfare provision. Of course, we need to learn from feminist perspective, from experience of the other world, especially when we think about how welfare at needs level, I would say, can be provided. And there, of course, the other forms of social relations will need to play a bigger role. But maybe the state can still be something in the transition stage, a kind of primus inter pares, which makes at least clear or safeguards that minimum need satisfaction levels are respected. And I also take the world system into it, especially when we think of global agreements, which is, I think I'm pushing there a bit over my weight, to be honest. Yeah. But we would probably need some kind of global agreement when it comes to the things that Inge was talking about yesterday. Matter and energy throughput are at the end of the day global problems. The atmosphere doesn't care from what part of the world the CO2 emissions are done. So. Yeah, so I take it on board and probably must disappoint you for now without not having all the theories built in so far.